Chapter 6. "My sister Glegg might take back her money now," said Mrs. Tulliver that evening, "and you have the difficult task of raising the £500 she lent you." Mr. Tulliver declared that he didn't care if Mrs. Glegg took back her money. He would not be beholden to his wife's sisters. Mrs. Tulliver silently resolved to talk to her sister Pullet when she went there for tea tomorrow. It made her feel better. Mr. Tulliver was also thinking of a visit he would make tomorrow, but he was not as comforted by these thoughts. He remembered the £300 he had lent to his brother-in-law, Moss, and planned to ask for it back. It was painful for him to think of his financial situation. He had a lot less money than most people would assume of a man who owned his own land and mill. And if weren't for the twice-a-year payments, he would have forgotten about the mortgage he had on the land. He would have more money if not for his sister. She had married quite beneath her, and subsequently had 8 babies. He thought of this as he rode out to the Mosses the next day. Their farm was quite far away, and sat on unfertile land in the poor parish of Bassett. It irritated Tulliver that they were so poor. He thought that by asking Moss to pay back the £300, it would force the man to make something more of himself. He rode with great irritation along the muddy roads. Even the rusty farm gate irritated him when he reached it. Mrs. Moss heard her brother arrive and came outside with the baby in her arms. "I'm glad to see you," she said, "but I wasn't expecting you today. How are you?" "Oh, pretty well, Mrs. Moss, pretty well," answered her brother with cool deliberation. She could see at once that he was not in a good mood. He never visited her unless he was angry about something. "Is your husband home?" "No, he's in the potato field. I'll send my boy to fetch him. Will you come in?" "No, I must get back home soon," said Mr. Tulliver. "And how are Mrs. Tulliver and the children?" "Pretty well. Tom will go to a new school. It will be a big expense for me." "Well, I'd wish you'd let the children come see their cousins soon. They're very fond of Maggie. And I know she likes to come. She is a loving child, and quick and clever too." Mrs. Moss was a simple woman who couldn't realise how praising Maggie could so favourably affect her brother. He was so used to people criticising his dear daughter. He began to soften. "Well, she is more fond of you than her other aunts. She takes after our family," he said. He looked at his sister and her many children and felt an arrow in his heart. Maggie was very dear to him, and he couldn't help but compare his relationship with his sister to that between Maggie and Tom. Would Tom ever be so hard on her? "I've always done what I could for you," he said softly. "I'm not denying that, brother, and I'm grateful," said poor Mrs. Moss. "Ah, but here's my husband. What took you so long?" "But I ran all the way here," said Mr. Moss. He looked at his brother-in-law. "Won't you come in?" he said. Mr. Tulliver decided he would rather do his business away from his sister and suggested a walk through the garden. Mr. Tulliver sat down on a bench and looked around. He decided to pick a fight. "Why, you only planted wheat this year. Surely someone who is lucky enough to borrow money without paying interest can do better than that." "I know I'm behind with the payments," said Mr. Moss, "but I was unlucky with the wool last year, and with things were harder than usual." "Aye," snarled Mr. Tulliver, "for some people things are always hard." "I don't know what fault you have to find with me, Mr. Tulliver," said Mr. Moss. "You'll find no one works harder. What's the use of hard work when a man's got no capital? I can't wait for my money any more. I have to pay Mrs. Glegg £500, and then there's Tom. You have to see how you can pay me back the £300. Mr. Moss looked blank. "Well, if that's the case, I'll have to sell my entire herd, to pay you and the landlord too." Mr. Tulliver found poor relatives irritating, and had become irritated with Mr. Moss enough to say, "Well, do what you have to do. I can't find money for everybody else as well as myself. I have to look out for my own business and my own family. I can't wait for the money any longer. You'll have to raise it as quickly as you can." He got up abruptly and walked away. He paused at the kitchen door to see his sister and her children. He bade a quick goodbye and rode away. He got as far as the gate. He looked around at the dilapidated farm and sighed, turning his horse around and riding back to his sister. She had been crying. Don't worry, he said gently. Don't worry. I'll make do without the money for a bit. Just try to be as clever as you can. Mrs. Moss's tears came again at this kindness, and she thanked him. Mr. Tulliver promised to bring Maggie, and once again rode away. He felt as if he had escaped some sort of danger, for if he were too hard on his sister, it might make Tom hard on Maggie some day. His love and anxiety for his daughter had given him a new attitude towards his sister.